I'm really happy to be here, not only because I do know Jack from back in the day, and that is actually, 2004 is where the beginning of this research started for me by mistake. I was actually in Tehran doing something totally different. I was in the Khomeini archives working on something completely different than clothing and fashion, but that became, retail therapy became a release and a way to get away from, one thing I would do with my Iranian friends. And it sort of percolated in the back of my head for 10 years and became sort of the beginning of what is now Pious Fashion, the book that came out from Harvard last year. And it's also fun to be here because my first job out of grad school was at the Berkeley Center. So I was one of the first postdocs I had. Professor Haddad is part of the reason that happened. And that was where I finished the revisions on my first book, which is about, it's a comparative look at Catholic and Shia understandings of leadership and rhetoric around clerics. So I have a warm spot in my heart for Georgetown, so it's fun to be here. Okay, and I'm actually, in some ways I'm sorry, I'm not going to be talking so much about Pious Fashion, the book, but I wanted to sort of think about where I'm moving next. So this is a little bit of a bridge between that book, Pious Fashion, and my new book, Stealing Your Religion, which is also, I'm writing for Harvard, which is more of a book about religious appropriation. So I'm going to sort of give you some information today or talk about themes and topics that link and that bridge those two pieces of work. So let me start by saying it's been a really hard week for Muslims worldwide. The community's had to deal with the murder of 51 Muslims by a white nationalist, as well as increased feelings of vulnerability in sacred spaces. And in the US, this massacre has sort of spurred increased and more conversations about the effect of white supremacy and white nationalism on anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia. And this is something, sorry, make sure I have a place to put everything. I just realized I didn't start my timer, I don't want to go over. Stopwatch. And this is something that scholars, this sort of connection between white nationalism and white supremacy and anti-Muslim violence is something that scholars have been talking about for a long time. So I'm thinking about someone like Sylvia Chain Malik, Todd Green, or I know you're hosting Elise Morgenstein next week, and she's been talking about this a lot as well. They've been warning about this to us for a while, that when you demonize Muslim people and beliefs, when you spread false stories and lies about Islam, when you constantly frame Muslims as foreigners and as the enemy, you not only make violence against Muslims possible, you make that violence seem logical. And I've seen a lot of great conversations on Twitter and in op-eds about this in the last week, really pointing at the danger of anti-Muslim rhetoric, especially that coming from the alt-right and our own president. But I want to think about something slightly different but related today. I want to think about the role that well-intentioned liberals have in contributing to anti-Muslim hate that permeates not only our politics but also our culture. So instead of rhetoric, I want to think about material culture, because that's what I work in, popular culture, and I want to think particularly about clothing. Let's see how this works for me. Okay, so many liberals would probably see this image of the New Zealand MP who's wearing hijab as she visits Muslim communities this week as a symbol of respect. And actually, I don't know enough about the New Zealand context to really read this image properly for you. But think about a leader in the US wearing a hijab in a similar circumstance. So would you feel the same way if Melania Trump wore it? Or maybe a more difficult question, would you feel the same if former First Lady Michelle Obama wore it? Is there a way in which well-intentioned wearing, adoption of Muslim clothing by non-Muslims does some sort of harm? And I think if for non-Muslims to be really good allies of the Muslim community in the US, we really have to be careful to distinguish between when the appropriation of religious clothing is exploitation, corruption, tokenism, and when it's dialogue, integration, or respect, and how we draw the line. And that's the kind of things I want to think about today. So I've been thinking a lot about this for the book I'm currently working on for Harvard University Press. Like I said, the tentative title is Stealing Your Religion. And in this book, I'm exploring the ways in which non-religious affiliated people, non-religiously affiliated Americans actually, so really frankly folks like me, are increasingly adopting religious practices as ways to find meaning in their lives. So I'm asking about the ethical implications of these borrowings. So think of something like yoga. I have a case study in the book about yoga. How do attempts to honor Indian roots of modern yoga actually, how is that offensive to some Indians? How do yoga studios help maintain race and class privilege? And for those white women like myself who find tremendous physical and mental benefits from our time on the mats, what can we do to decolonize our yoga practice? So I want today to think about how this framework instilling religion, that's something I'm calling the ethics of religious appropriation, might help us figure out what forms of recent celebration of Muslim fashion that we're seeing in the US, how some of these might be helpful for countering anti-Muslim racism, and what other ones might not be. So first, just a little bit more history, and a little bit more about my relationship to this topic. So here's a picture. The last book that I did was a study of Muslim fashion through a comparative study of 3 Muslim majority cities. So I have a case study about Tehran, one about Jakarta, and one about Istanbul. And this, at the time, was a topic of great interest to Muslim women, and it had been for some time. But for the decade I worked on this topic, 'cause I'm counting the time that Jack and I were in Tehran. So from 2004, for about 10 years, I was collecting research. For the decade I worked on this topic, non-Muslims living in the West basically ignored it. Journalists ignored politics, designers ignored its potential market, and ordinary folks just ignored its aesthetics. Then suddenly, as I was finishing the final edits of my book, which was 2016, pious fashion seemed to be everywhere. Oops, there we go. As if it had suddenly become authorized as interesting and newsworthy to non-Muslim audiences. So in 2006, this image on the left, Dolce & Gabbana released its first ever collection of headscarves and coordinated abayas, and Uniqlo released a Moss collection designed by UK Muslim designer Hana Tajima, and the fashion journalists raved. They just went crazy. They were so excited. Then in 2007, CoverGirl announced its first hijabi brand ambassador. My students were very impressed. And last summer, The Gap ran a back-to-school ad featuring a young hijabi girl. About time. And at first, I thought all this attention was good news. I thought it was a sign of acceptance that Muslims are part of mainstream Western culture and a celebration of their contribution to it. But now, I'm not so sure. Not all appreciation by the dominant culture is welcome. That's a lesson of cultural appropriation that we've learned. And this is even more true when the item being celebrated has complicated political and religious symbolic meanings. So today I just want to focus on 2 high-profile cases in the US in which Muslim fashion is consumed and celebrated by non-Muslims. It's the adoption of the flag-hijab imagery around the 2017 Women's March, and a more recent exhibition of Muslim fashion at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco. And I argue that these are forms of aesthetic appreciation, but they're meant to be, they're well-intentioned, right? They're meant to sort of celebrate these aesthetics, this fashion. But they have very different effects on the actual public realities of Muslim women in the US. And not all these effects are positive, and I'm going to offer some thoughts of why that is. So let me start by saying I can't believe that 2 years later we are still talking about the flag hijab image. But as I was putting together this PowerPoint, my 10-year-old, who's in the public school in Brookline, saw this image in my PowerPoint and said, "Oh, Mommy, I know that. My art teacher has it up on her wall." So it does very much still circulate, particularly within non-Muslim communities, as a sign of some sort of feminist solidarity politics. So for those who don't know, although I'm sure most of you do, I'll just a little reminder that in the winter 2017, Shepard Farley, who was most widely known for his Obama Hope portrait, released the We Are the People series designed to protest President-elect Donald Trump. The series of 3 images includes a African-American woman on the left, a Muslim woman, and a Latino. Women who, according to Farley, were made more vulnerable by Trump's election and were likely to be neglected and targeted by his administration. Now, the woman you can see in the African-American portrait is wearing a red button-up, and she has long braids. The Latino portrait, the woman has a raven printed on her T-shirt and a big rose pinned at the right ear of her wavy hair. And the Muslim American woman has a red lip, a strong brow, but her image is dominated by one item of clothing, a headscarf made of an American flag, with stars draped on one side and stripes on the other. Of the three images, it was the Muslim American portrait that was most widely adopted as a sign of solidarity politics during the Women's March. It was carried during, you've seen these images, I'm sure, carried during the inauguration by many women, and many women, including a lot of my colleagues actually on campus, replaced their Facebook photos with it. It was really widely adopted by non-Muslim feminists as a sign of solidarity, as a sign of intersectional feminist politics. So along with pink pussy hats, the flag-hijab portrait became the symbol of feminist protest in 2017. So it's helpful to begin with why this image is so readily adopted. So I think there are aesthetic and political reasons. For one, it's a really beautiful image. Farley is a really talented artist, and his image feels both very timeless and also of the moment. It feels very current. The woman represented in the poster is attractive, and his graphic interpretation of her is like the best filter you could ever put on a photograph, right? It's high contrast, it's vivid color, it's sharp. It's the filter I put on all my Instagram posts when I want to look 10 years younger. So I think that and here I'm thinking about liberal, white, non-Muslim women, they liked this flag hijab portrait also for political reasons, because it pushed back against Trump's own political aesthetic, right? He was representing himself as white masculinity, a little bit of evangelicalism, and a little bit of misogyny. So the flag hijab portrait was everything that Trump was not. It was female, it was brown, and it was Muslim. But many, and I mean many Muslim women, were critical of how this image was used as a symbol of feminist politics. And if you want to think about why in terms of thinking about morphing cultural appropriation analysis for this, in this sort of way of religious appropriation that I'm trying to do in my new work, that would have us focus on, who is this image maybe stolen from, but then also what is this image doing? What is it erasing? What misperceptions is art promoting, and what facts is it just erasing? So for some, it's the production of the image that's really the problem. The image is created by a white man, Shepard Farley, and the original image on the left is a photograph by a male Muslim American photographer. Now the woman in the photograph, whose name is Munira Ahmed, she's a Muslim American who lives in Queens, or did at the time. And every interview I've ever read with Ms. Ahmed, she really likes this image. She's supportive of the image and delighted by Farley's portrait of her. But as activists, someone like activist Hoda Hatami that we were just talking about, has pointed out, Ms. Ahmed does not wear hijab in real life, in her normal life. She put it on just for the purpose of creating this image. So the question is really, who owns the image of women in hijab? Can it be someone like Shepard Farley, a white male non-Muslim? Can it be the Muslim male photographer? Can it be this Muslim woman who herself does not wear the hijab? Or are there ways in which hijabis themselves felt like this image was stolen from them, that their likeness was stolen from them? And even if Ms. Ahmed is not offended by the circulation of her image, other Muslim women were. So here are just some things I'm going to run through. So this is probably very familiar to a lot of you who are familiar with the flag hijab. But when white, non-Muslim women adopted this image as a sign of their political feminism, to many Muslim women it smacked of tokenism. Muslim women's bodies trotted out by non-Muslims for protest politics without any real engagement with the Muslim community. Another objection was that the woman in Farley's portrait was wearing a headscarf. Now, like in the African-American portrait, her braids are supposed to sort of signal to you that she's African-American. In the Latino portrait, it's like the red flower. The hijab is what's supposed to make the woman seem immediately readable as a Muslim. But not all Muslim women cover in this way. And to represent all Muslim women with a hijab erases the diversity of opinions on this practice within the Muslim community. So adopting an image of headscarf women as the symbol of the Muslim community reinforces the idea that Muslim womanhood is properly performed with a headscarf in public, and only performed with a headscarf in public, and works against Muslim women who see this as an outdated practice. Now, to make things worse, the woman in the image is not just wearing a hijab, she's wearing one made of an American flag, which liturgically is just ridiculous. Muslim women do not go around wrapping themselves in national flags on their heads as part of their modest clothing. It's not a normal, everyday covering practice. Now, the other two images in the series, again, if you go back to these, do not incorporate such blatant symbols of patriotism. Is it a problem that a Muslim woman in a solid hijab would not be immediately readable as American? The message implied in Farley's image is that Muslim women, in order to belong, have to literally be cloaked in the fabric of America. So for many Muslim Americans, the U.S. flag also has a problematic association with U.S. military operations in Muslim-majority nations and more recent acts of anti-Muslim legislation and policies coming out of this administration. So putting a Muslim woman in a flag hijab is forcing her to consent to this violence and discrimination, literally folding her into the national narrative despite the fact that her voice, her community, has often been excluded from it. The celebration of a flag hijab image is the erasure of the American violence against Muslims. Now, one of the most offensive uses of the flag hijab I've ever seen was during World Hijab Day. And this is a day, in case you're not familiar with it, happens in February, where non-Muslim women around the world put on hijab. It's supposed to be a way to express solidarity in the Muslim community, for them to become more familiar with the practice. When you put on a flag hijab on World Hijab Day, the message that I read is that, oh, I want to try out this whole hijab thing, but I also need to signal my allegiance to the US so that no one takes me as an actual foreigner, so I'm going to do it with this American flag. But even more problematic, and the best evidence I have that this sort of flag hijab, World Hijab Day practice doesn't actually produce any solidarity or real tolerance, doesn't make any real concrete difference, is with the image on the left, which is two NYPD police officers in flag hijab on World Hijab Day. Now, these officers are publicly performing Islamic tolerance at the exact same time that there's a class action suit against the NYPD, who are being sued for taking off women's headscarves for mugshots. So this is an ongoing case that's going on right now. So this makes clear that an idealized, sanitized version of the hijab is okay, just not the one worn by actual Muslims. And it's not that wearing a hijab on World Hijab Day, or even carrying a Farley portrait at the Women's March, or putting it on your Facebook picture, or posting it in your office, is the same as being a white nationalist and sort of spouting anti-Muslim rhetoric. The intentions and the results are much more complex than that. But the danger of these cultural practices is that they are simultaneously maintain the basic power structure between Muslims and Muslims and non-Muslims, rather, Muslims and non-Muslim women in the US, and at the same time mask the problematic representations of Islam by presenting these acts as if they're just feminist progressive politics. So the example of the flag hijab shows how the popularization, how the popularization of Islamic aesthetics can be used to contribute to the marginalization of Muslims. Okay, but this doesn't have to be the case, and I want to look at a more positive example and take you through some pictures that you may not be as familiar with. Does anyone know about the DeYoung exhibit? Has anyone been there? Okay, so these maybe will be images that are not, I mean, the flag hijab everyone's seen, but these will be some new images for us. Okay, so last fall, it's already closed. Closed in January. Last fall, San Francisco's DeYoung exhibit, DeYoung Museum, which is the big modern art museum in San Francisco, if you're not familiar with the Bay Area. It opened the first ever major exhibit devoted to Islamic fashion, ever, anywhere globally. It was the whole exhibit. There have been other sort of exhibits I've looked at pieces of in history, but the whole exhibit devoted to contemporary Muslim fashion. It was the title of it was Contemporary Muslim Fashions. There's a picture of the catalog right there, which is gorgeous. It costs $80, but it's just full of beautiful images. Now, the exhibit was curated by the museum's textile experts, as well as consultation with scholars who work on Muslim fashion and Islamic studies, and a local advisory board made up of Bay Area Muslims. Now, the final product is a display of 80 swoon-worthy ensembles. I'll walk you through the exhibit a little bit. Glamorous gowns, edgy streetwear, conceptual couture, loosely organized by region, and emphasizing very distinct textile traditions by region. Now, the DeYoung's mission statement, which is here, will help us get a sense for the intention of the exhibit. So according to their website, we are an art museum, a vital public place where objects illuminate the past, speak of the present, and shape the future. Doers, creators, thinkers, citizens of the world, those who eagerly face the unfamiliar, you are all welcome here. So it seems clear at least one intended audience of the exhibit was non-Muslims, who would be unfamiliar with Muslim fashions, And thus the DeYoung hoped to educate the public through Islam through the display of objects. And if we have time, I'm happy to talk about how not every curation of religious clothing can do this well. If you've seen the Met's exhibit on heavenly bodies, I think that is an example of a poor curation in terms of religious content. But this is at least the DeYoung exhibit is saying this is part of their intent. And I think they're more successful. So the question becomes, how can merely viewing Muslim fashion be a form of public education about Islam? How can it help combat Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism? So let's take a little walk through the exhibit. Can you guess the first thing you see?
It's a video.
No. It's Shepard Farley.
It's on sale for $50 now, the book. So,
It's not free anymore? It's not free and downloadable?
oh,
Shepard Farley. Oh, the book, the catalog.
yeah.
Oh, good. That's worth it. $50, it's worth it then. So the first thing you see when you enter is actually Shepard Farley's poster. But there's actually no discussion of it. And this is, I walked through the exhibit. These are exhibit photos. They're official photos. I actually walked through the exhibit the week before it opened with the curators. And their excuse or their rationale for it is this exhibit is supposed to meet people where they are, what they're familiar with, and as you walk through the exhibit, it's supposed to push you further and further outside your comfort zone. So that's why Shepard Farley we start with right there. I'm not even going to talk about that anymore, though. This is the first collection of outfits that you see when you walk in. And what do you notice about them? What do you notice about this image? Either how they're staged, what colors do you see? Yeah.
The models are very European.
Sorry, say again?
The first thing you notice is the models are very European features.
The models are European, the actual mannequins themselves.
The mannequin.
Yeah, what do you notice about the clothing?
It's just monochromatic.
Monochromatic?
This is the prayers. We use this for prayers.
Yeah, so this is full body, golfy looking, maybe black and white, high couture, maybe high fashion versions of full body coverings. So beautiful, but maybe not surprising or shocking to. So this was like maybe what you'd expect to see in a sort of, here's an art museum trying to show off what Muslim fashion looks like. Oh, okay, yeah, this is beautiful versions of Muslim fashion. So we start here. And these are mostly Gulf designers. And then the first corridor, it kind of continues with, again, a lot of white and black, a lot of full body. You might notice that already, though, some models have heads coverings, some do not. The head coverings are actually all styled by a woman, one of the local women from the Bay Area who's on the advisory board. She just like came in and did the headscarves for them all. And it was intentional to include some with and some without, as sort of a reflection of the Muslim community. Then you turn the corner, we start moving outside of sort of Gulf designers to more European American-based designers, again, still very formal. Across from those more formal, you start moving into more colors and more informal streetwear. So just take this shot, this collection. On the left, that's an outfit that was sold at Macy's. So it's like a ready-to-wear, affordable outfit. Notice again the colors, the fabrics are changing, much more pattern, much more street style. Then immediately to the right, we have things, I'll show you later on a close-up of this, Girl Scout uniforms designed by a Muslim designer, things like burkinis, sportswear. And then you turn the corner, and on the left, these are European and US-based designers for the most part, and on the right is where we start to see the Southeast Asian designers who really steal the show. The DeYoung has a lot of expertise in the textiles of these traditions, of these communities, and everything is like exquisitely beaded, and the textiles are just, sorry, this image is not super sharp, but the textiles are just so rich and gorgeous. So this is all in the sort of Southeast Asian area. And then as you continue, you see these sort of chiffony gowns, and then again, more sort of design house, high couture. I'll give you a little close-up of these. So these are the chiffony, again, sort of abaya looking, maybe what you'd expect, but in brighter colors, exquisite beadwork. Pieces on the right, again, very formal. And you end with like this Dior black and white gown and things worn by, Muslim royalty. Okay, so let's ask that question again. In what manner can just seeing the aesthetics of Muslim fashion challenge popular stereotypes about Islam. So imagine you're walking through this exhibit. We'll do it again real quick. Here I am. I don't know anything. I am not Muslim. I have no interaction with the Muslim community. I have no close Muslim friends. I know nothing about the fashion of the region. I'm coming to this exhibit. I'm walking through. What can merely viewing these pieces, and it is a very interactive exhibit. There are videos and music playing at the same time, as you mentioned. But what can just viewing this clothing, what does it push back against? In ways that the flag hijab does not. Here's the first lesson, I think. That modesty in among Muslims in the world does not mean the same thing everywhere. And that's like probably the first lesson, and that's probably the thing that drew me the most to writing Pious Fashion. So like moving from a place like Tehran, where modesty is performed a certain way and looks a certain way, to Indonesia, where the fit is different. Modesty is just defined differently about what is covered in terms of skin versus body shape. A belt would be read as maybe modest in Indonesia, not in Tehran. So modesty itself is different in different locations. And that becomes really clear when you walk through the exhibit. These are all images from the catalog. The first is a photograph of street style in Tehran, and the other two are the catalog images of outfits that are actually in the exhibit. So again, entering this exhibit, and I had like sort of a test case. I have a friend from Brookline who happened to be in San Francisco during the exhibit, and I sent her. She knows nothing about, she doesn't, she's works for NPR, doesn't know anything about, never been to a Muslim majority country, never had sort of really close Muslim friends. And I sort of said, what did you notice at first? She's like, whoa, it's much more diverse than I thought it was going to be. I was surprised there weren't all head coverings. I can't believe that trench coat was in there. I want to wear that. I want to wear that skirt. So again, I think this is actually a real important lesson for people, for particularly non-Muslims, because of course, while there are references to modest dress in the sacred written texts of Islam, these religious texts do not spend a lot of time discussing what that Muslim attire should look like, right? So once we start to pay attention to how Muslims dress, especially how Muslim women dress, we quickly realize that modesty does not look the same way everywhere. Now, the curators of the DeYoung exhibit figured this out really early on. For instance, the exhibit was originally called Fashion of Islam. That's what the curators wanted to call it. That's what the DeYoung named it, Fashion of Islam. You notice anything about that title?
It's pretty uniform.
The Fashion of Islam. The advisory board was like, That makes it sound like there's one style of clothing for all Muslims in the world, and that doesn't represent the diversity. So they very quickly changed the title to Muslim fashions. That's a big difference based on that feedback. Okay, so these are two of my favorite images from the catalog that are in the exhibit as well. So understanding the diversity of the Muslim community is not only true, of course, globally. And here we have a design on the left from Saudi Arabia, on the right, a US-based designer. So that sort of spread, that regional spread, is really important in the exhibit. But then also, I think, thinking about this just in the American context, the different American designers are represented, they all have a very different sort of street style. Some of them sort of doing this cool mashup hybridity thing that we see on the right here. So there's tremendous diversity among Muslims in the US, right? Which you may not know if you're not someone who studies or interacts with them. You might not know that 58% of Muslims in the US are immigrants. You may not know that they come from 75 countries. That US-born Muslims are diverse as well. For instance, I always surprise my non-Muslim students when, by saying that more than half the Muslims in the US who've been here for 3 generations are black. Like, Muslims are not all Arab. So having this sort of display of the clothing, that DeYoung, that really exposes the viewer, the museum goer, to that diversity. And so, I mean, for example, this outfit on the right is probably my favorite in the whole exhibit. And just because it's just a fun mashup of like camo parachute hip hop pants, and then this sort of like African batik wax print top, like sort of really pulling on her, what she's understanding to be her roots. She's Philly-based designer, her roots both here and abroad. And I think this really makes clear to the viewer, the takeaway is that there are many ways to sartorially express your Muslim identity and faith, because there are just many ways of being Muslim. Okay, Okay, I think this is a second lesson from the exhibit. Again, even if you're just like walking through and seeing what you see, I think you learn that lesson, that important lesson that Muslim women don't need savings. So again, many Westerners still think that modest clothing is the ultimate sign of Muslim women oppression. They assume that clothing, from headscarves to full body coverings, they assume all that is based on some outdated idea that women's bodies are overly sexual and must be hidden. And according to this line of thought, they see all modest clothing as either forced on women by their Muslim men in their lives or an expression of an overzealous form of piety. But the DeYoung exhibit makes it clear that a number of Muslim women use their take on modest fashion to express identity. So take this American body positive influencer who has 40,000 Instagram followers. She is an influencer, right, okay. She posts images of herself like these in order to raise awareness about eating disorders, racism, fat shaming, and her style is part of how she's able to show that Black, fat, and Muslim are beautiful, cool, and powerful. And designers who are displaying the exhibit have also used clothing as more direct political protests affecting their communities. So here we have a scarf that's included in the exhibit, which is, I mean, you can probably tell what it, I mean, maybe you can't tell, but it's supposed to be a critique of the Muslim ban, right? So it's a NASA satellite image of the countries that are banned by the U.S. by Trump's travel ban, overlaid with the word banned, and this was sold to raise money for legal nonprofits who are combating the ban in the U.S. So there's a couple of very political activists, fashion as activism pieces in the exhibit, with explanations of why, what they were doing, the kind of work they were doing, how the designers see themselves as representing, pushing back, helping their community, drawing awareness to issues that their community cares about. I think another thing you notice is that when you walk through the DeYoung, is that Muslims are contributing to mainstream society. And I guess maybe that's not surprising, except for if you look at the last Pew survey on this from 2017, 50% of Americans think that Islam is not part of mainstream society in the US. They just think it's fringe and outside. So the DeYoung exhibit shows, Muslim models, Muslim designers, and that they're increasingly recognized by the fashion world. Muslim women are not just seen as the consumers of this clothing, but also the important tastemakers. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice that Muslim women are influencing mainstream designers and retailers by demanding clothing that allows them to navigate trends while being true to their faith. So there's, of course, modest couture that's commissioned by wealthy Muslim women by top design houses. You saw the example of the Dior at the end. There are ready-to-wear global brands that now sell affordable modest lines of elegantly simplistic pieces. And these lines are inspired by Islamic aesthetics, but they're marketed to all consumers, not just Muslim ones. So if you take Uniqlo, which was, again, one of the leaders back in that 2016, 2017, wow, modest fashion's a thing. And that's 2016 was their first collection where they were working with a Muslim designer. And that was marketed as a modest collection. In the most recent collection, so this is 2000, here's my pointer. This is from the current collection. Notice how the language about this collection has changed. So it's embodying a rich sense of cultural diversity. This exclusive collection features elegantly simplistic yet considered pieces, offering comfortable, versatile clothing for all women of all backgrounds, regardless of age, race, culture, or belief. Modesty is not in there. Islam's not in there. These are garments that are marketed to anyone who wants to be culturally sensitive, and they're all versatile. It's clothing for the cosmopolitan women of all backgrounds. If you shop at Uniqlo, you probably own a couple from this collection, even if you weren't intentionally trying to. Or take this exhibit, and this part of the exhibit. So on the left, you have Girl Scout uniforms that were created by a modest streetwear designer for the UK Girl Scout chapters. So it's a sweatshirt dress, which is a little longer in the back because Muslim scouts were complaining that their scout outfits would sort of ride up as they were doing things related to their badges. And these pieces, and to the right is actually part of the ad campaign for the outfits, for the new redesigned clothing. And they were worn by non-Muslim and Muslim girls alike. So it's interesting to think about how Muslim designer really changed the look of this very quintessential British organization, an organization that counts Queen Elizabeth and Kate Middleton as alumni. Certainly that's some sort of proof that there is a mainstreamed influence of modest fashion, of Islamic aesthetics occurring. So to be hip today is to be culturally inclusive. And this includes modest styles created by Muslim designers and popularized by Muslim consumers. Fashion makes it clear that Muslims are not only part of mainstream society, they're contributors to it. And I want to end, I have another image I want to show you before that. I just want to just briefly recap here. Okay, so I sort of showed you two cases in the US, which share an intention to really include Muslims in the sort of public citizenship. They want to celebrate Muslim aesthetics, celebrate Muslims, and bring them into some sort of liberal version of the public space. But I don't think they succeed in the same kind of ways, right? They share a realization that Muslim women's clothing is not merely the sign of some worrisome creep of Islam. They share an appreciation for Islamic sartorial aesthetics. They share an intention to include Muslims in the performativity of citizenship. Yet one succeeds while the other fails. The DeYoung exhibit has clear civic benefits in terms of increasing understanding of the Muslim community to non-Muslims, while the adoption of the flag-hijab is more ethically fraught. And what makes them so different? Well, in part, the art exhibit was more successful because it was an engagement with the sartorial choices and designs of Muslims. They thus allowed the non-Muslim museum visitor to challenge their own pre-existing assumptions about the public meaning of modest clothing. The adoption of the flag-hijab image, on the other hand, has no direct engagement of a Muslim woman. It's not created by a Muslim woman in the same kind of way. Rather, it's an idealized visual representation of a Muslim woman by an artist, by a non-Muslim white artist. And the political aesthetics of the portrait appeal to non-Muslim women's values rather than challenging them. Adoption of the image could communicate tolerance, but it did not necessarily correspond with any new understanding. So put another way, Shepard Farley's flag-hijab image is an example how Muslim aesthetics can be simultaneously politically productive and morally problematic, because it allows non-Muslims to adopt the aesthetics of Islam without necessarily engaging in the diversity, agency, and protest politics of actual Muslims living in the community. Okay, I want to end with one more question. I think it's worthwhile asking if the popularization of Muslim fashion is detrimental to the religious meaning of hijab within the US context. So this is an image, actually, can anyone guess what this image is from? This is a Coachella image. This is from a music festival. So it's become a thing where girls wearing very little, sometimes from the neck down, are wearing all kinds of cultural appropriation that happens during Coachella. People wear like native headscarves, they wear bindis. The new thing is that some wear hijabs. So this is part of my concern that I sort of signaled in the beginning about this recent interest in modest style by major apparel and cosmetic companies. So just this last week, Michael Kors came out with his first, I'm the American designer, he came out with his first line of abayas and headscarves. These companies are not just targeting Muslim women or thinking about catering Muslim women. They're also hoping that by incorporating Muslim women into ad campaigns, they'll appeal to non-Muslim women who value diversity and inclusivity in the marketplace. So think about that Gap ad I showed you in the beginning with the little hijabi girl. The market for that is not necessarily Muslim women. The market for that is me. The market is, I have a 10-year-old girl, and I want her to understand, diversity of her community, of the world. The market is sort of trying to make the brand is trying to make itself seem like a brand that supports those values. So I'm part of the market for that ad. And the reason why that's a problem is that it makes things like the flag hijab more readily adoptable. So in 2017, we were ready to adopt Farley's flag hijab as a sign of progressive politics because we'd been convinced already that hijab and being covered was somehow cool and in style right now. And when I say the we here is the, most cases, white non-Muslim woman. So this is really gesturing a lot more to my new book, but think about the evolution of the cross as an accessory in the US, right? So in the 1980s, the cross was really promoted by evangelicals as a symbol of sort of strong religious identity. So not really necessarily cool if you're not evangelical. Okay, what happened in the 90s, though, with the cross? Who's old enough to know what happened in the 90s?
Madonna video?
Madonna! Right? Thank you, Jack, for being old enough to remember that. Yeah, I mean, so then suddenly Madonna starts incorporating Catholic aesthetics into her countercultural her pop look. She made the cross cool because she used it ironically to express her sort of critique of sexual norms. And suddenly it became much more of a pop cultural trend than a sign of devotion. And when I try to explain this to my students, I tell them, look, I'm baptized Catholic. The only time I've ever worn a cross is when I went through my Madonna phase and I had crimped hair and my jelly bands and my gloves, my lace gloves, and a cross. It's the only time I ever wore the cross that my grandmother gave me. So I worry that we might be seeing something similar happening with the hijab, but something to at least keep our eye on. Is it becoming so commonly used in such a variety of visual, political, and countercultural ways by non-Muslims that it's losing its usefulness and readability as pious? And I'll leave you with one more image because France is such an easy target. So this happened earlier, and I was in Paris earlier this month, and this is what was happening in France. On the left, there's an image of an athletic hijab that's created by Decathlon, which is a French-based apparel company. They decided that they were not going to sell this in France because they received so much backlash when they announced that they were going to sell in France. They pulled it from the market. They were supposed to have it out this spring. That was happening. That was announced the same time that Paris Fashion Week was going on in Paris. Those two images on the right are from the runway by non-Muslim designers. So again, we see this sort of like, is it just that hijab is okay in France as long as it's actually not worn by Muslims? There's a number of references on the runway that read very much as references to hijab. These are just two examples. So again, it's just something to keep in mind as we move forward. I'm looking forward to our conversation if we have some time. Thank you.